You're listening to Maneuvering Mondays, a podcast about transforming work culture. This is the second part of the episode, and in this part, we have invited one or more guest experts to share their best advice to Marie from Zebra Apps. Your hosts are AK
and Ivana.
And for this commentary episode, we have invited a new guest speaker to discuss the story part. Welcome to Sam.
Thank you.
And Sam, you help companies build and scale digital products and improve product development capabilities. And you're also the founder and managing director of the company Startup Patterns, where you support technology organizations, actually much like the organization in the story, Zebra Apps, develop their technology leaders and high-performing development teams, and in general, strengthen their organizations. Is there anything you would like to add?
No, that's pretty good. I'm really excited to be here.
We're so excited to have you. Thanks for joining.
Great. Well, we usually start the show with a check-in question. And Sam and AK, in the past couple of weeks, can you share an experience that made you reflect on the nature of work?
Right. And this week, I actually experienced firsthand how sometimes, no matter how difficult and uncomfortable something might seem when you don't master it, you can and will succeed if you put in the hard work and you practice your skills, even if just a little bit every day. And I'm, of course, speaking about my 5-month-old baby again now, because she's finally started rolling. And until recently, it seemed completely impossible for her. And I thought, oh my God, is she going to be the last baby on earth to roll? But after we actually kept practicing a little every day, she just suddenly mastered it. And I know that all parents of many children will think this is really, of course, this is self-explanatory. But for me, as a first-time parent, I was super impressed that suddenly she just mastered the technique. And she's already now moving on to trying to creep and crawl. So yeah, that was my reflection this week.
That's awesome.
Great. Yeah. Oh, once they start crawling, oh boy, watch out.
I know. My life is getting so much more difficult now.
Great. So I'll go next. So I think the most impactful experience for me that has recently made me think about the nature of work was not necessarily a personal experience, but the bank trouble in the news, particularly Silicon Valley Bank, in recent weeks has resulted in a lot of the conversations that I have with clients and with colleagues, having people think about how their work relates to, the economy, relates to balancing the idea of profit versus purpose, which are sometimes at odds with each other, in individuals and also in companies as a whole. So I think it's exposed some tensions in how we in our organizations might make prioritization decisions. Do we, if we're not going to meet our objectives this year, what are we willing to invest in? There's a lot of talk about pulling back from investing in innovation or in people or in change. And I personally think that's a big mistake, that this is now actually a really good time to invest in people. So that's been having a lot of impacts in the conversations I have with different people every day. So it really has had me thinking about the future of work and my role in helping people figure that out for themselves and for their colleagues.
That's a super relevant reflection, both for the time that we're in, but also for this podcast episode. Well, I spent the last 2 weeks here in California, and my reflection about the nature of work is how human dependent it still is. Like being here, having the opportunity to meet people face to face, having these hallway conversations has really made some of the things that kind of were convoluted and difficult to figure out. It's made them easy. So just having these smaller conversations with people along the sides have pushed some big things. So I've kind of been reflecting on, wow, physical presence, even in our remote virtual world, the physical part, it still does make such a big difference. And just trying to reflect on, well, the world of work has moved more towards virtual and remote, but how do we balance that with the nature of human relationships that are still very much face-to-face?
Wow.
Well, I think we've all landed in the space of this episode and ready to get into Marie's world of work now. And Sam, could you describe in your own words what this episode was about?
Yeah. For me, the overarching theme of the episode was actually related to the idea of the tension between purpose and perhaps the way the episode describes it more around cultural values in an organization and the pressures and tensions of the day-to-day operations of, company providing goods and services for a market, needs to make a profit, needs to generate revenue, and how as companies grow and scale, that it's very easy for the original idealistic, perhaps, I'm not saying that as a good or a bad thing, but just objectively, following our ideals meets with the reality of running and building an organization, and things can be lost. And I think that the key moments in the narrative for me that were most impactful was, first, the realization that although Marie is pursuing a project of articulating values, articulating a culture map, if you will, for the company, the discovery that there already was something established early in the company's history and that had gotten lost along the way somehow. And I imagine we'll discover more about how that happened. But it's interesting because it frames a person, our hero of the story, in kind of going through this discovery process through lots of, as you said, one-on-one conversations with people, where she and her group and her team are intending to create something new, and yet there's also almost like a archeological process that suddenly unfolds of like, oh, actually some of this work has already been done, and that the founder actually had some ideals, and you get the sense that like you'd never know it to talk to them now that they still have these ideals, or we don't know, right? Like we haven't had that dialogue in the story yet, but that actually is really interesting for people to look at a company in its current state rather than today's configuration of the company and the mindsets of people is just a snapshot in a historical process that has an origin, and things have changed over time, and new people have come in with their own ideas and values and agendas. And that was a really rich illustration of how companies can kind of lose their way. So that's, for me, that's what the episode was all about.
I love that you call it an archaeological process. That's exactly what it is, like going back through the layers of history of a company and realizing, oh, this already exists.
Yeah. And why haven't we seen it yet?
Yeah. And why
is
doesn't HR know what the company values are?
right?
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
And why did the values actually disappear from the presentation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why isn't it stated at the beginning of every meeting that everyone has? Let's just remind ourselves.
When you were reading through this, Sam, were there any methodologies or models or tools that you came to think about?
Yeah. There are two concepts that come to mind right away. One that stood out was a reference to the mind games that might be going on between characters. And I think at one point, I can't recall exactly, it might be Marie references having seen an article on LinkedIn about mind games in the office. And I laughed out loud when I read that, because she very well could have been looking at my LinkedIn feed for the last couple of years, because I've written a lot about mind games in the office. And so that one really jumped out as something really crucial for people to understand. And we included in our work with leaders in our coaching around at Startup Patterns of the concept, first created by Eric Byrne back in the 60s, but there is this concept of a game which is essentially a kind of typically unconscious or subconscious set of behavioral patterns that people enact, usually, rooted deep in sort of childhood things that they learned and picked up. And those behaviors are all throughout our lives. And so because our work and our organizations are included in our lives, they show up there as well. And so I thought that there were a couple of illustrations, I think, in this episode of noticing that there are games people play. And again, like the word game has been sort of debated of, is that the best label for this phenomenon? But nonetheless, to understand that when you're working with colleagues, people are operating from a set of assumptions that many of which may be pretty subconscious, that they may just kind of operate through various, adopted and learned behaviors that without a bit of self-awareness and reflection, they're not necessarily aware of, and so that can create these interesting dynamics of conflict with people that, everyone sort of gets caught in the game, whatever's going on in that moment. I was thinking in particular, the coaching she's supposed to do with the executive, and he doesn't want to show up. And like, I've seen that before. I've known people like that.
Exactly. This specific
and he's messing with her,
interesting dynamics. Like, what is he up to?
Yeah, what is he up to? And you see that a lot, right? So it's sort of like there are power games. There's lots of patterns like this that show up in organizations. So I love that was expressed through the narrative, and I think it'll really resonate with readers who will get to that part of the book and say, whoa, it's not just me. Like, I'm not crazy. This actually happens in organizations and somebody's actually aware of it. So I think that'll really be relief for readers to see that this is, this is a real thing and something that leaders have to grapple with, both in themselves, but also in mentoring and coaching their people, to be aware of the psychodynamics between people trying to work together, trying to accomplish hard things collaboratively. A lot of emotions come up and games will happen. So that was really powerful. I thought that was great to have that in. The other model that comes to mind, again, one that we use a lot in our work, it is, I think of it as kind of an influence map, where something that you said, Ivana, about having a lot of small conversations to move a big thing forward. And so I think there's definitely a sense, in the episode, I'm sure it's just going to be a continual theme because of the nature of the main character's work, that in my world, often, particularly in companies that there are a lot of technical people building technical stuff, there's a tendency to embrace an overly analytical view of how work gets done, that, we can solve everything with categorization and process and structure. And I'm a process person. I love process. I'm not down, I'm not, talking down the process at all, but I think there's a place for it. But that the way that decisions are made in organizations isn't actually strictly through the hierarchy of an org chart or through even processes and procedures. A lot of the work is done that way, but I think the more interesting work happens between people, and those people can be across different departments. They can be at different hierarchical levels. And so there's a lot of, water cooler talk or back channel talk that happens anyway, and that you can actually leverage that phenomenon on purpose. And the fact that she finds herself having a number of one-on-one or small group conversations with people in order to move an initiative forward. I think that's a really powerful pattern that I certainly see a lot. I advise people to do that sort of thing, right? So I'm a believer in the lots of small one-on-one conversations, because that's, organizations are groups of people, and groups of people. Whenever you have people in groups, there is politics, there's questions of governance, and how do we distribute decision making, and how do we make decisions around trade-offs and scarce resources. And so, I don't think of a lot of people talk about organization politics like it's a bad thing. I think of it more just like gravity. It's just there, like, try not to fall on your face, but like, there's gravity and you kind of have to deal with it. Right? You learn how to run or walk or roll over, as the case may be. Right? So that was pretty interesting to me.
Just a follow-up question. You mentioned, you said the word influence map. So if you were to work with this more in depth, what would it be like an actual map, or what? How would you approach this task?
I was referring to, you could discuss it as a concept verbally, but I also do sometimes leverage a diagram or physical artifact that we might do on a whiteboard or a piece of paper. I learned a version of this from a colleague, David Bland, that I worked with many years ago at NEO, and I'm kind of since sort of enhanced my own, added my own spices and flavors to it. But usually the way that I think about it is you can take the org chart or a piece of the org chart that's in question. And if you are, I think the easiest way to think about it is if you draw the org chart, let's say on the wall or on a paper, and the subject that we're discussing is, we want to make a change in the organization. We want to introduce a new program. We want to change the way we're doing things. There's some thing that needs people's support, right? So you could think of it as maybe like there's a grassroots political campaign we have to wage to see if we can get the maximum number of people on board for doing the new thing, the new way. And so what you might do is you might look at the diagram of people in the chart and, disclaimer, you should think carefully about how public you want to be about making this influence map, because people will have reactions to it. But, as something I might keep in my pocket, I might note everyone on the org chart where I think they are, plus, minus, or neutral on being in favor of this initiative. Mm-hmm. And then you can also possibly map relationships that that exist, where there are people in an org who may be influenced by the opinions of other people because they know each other, they used to work together, they went to school together, they worked at a different company and had a different relationship, whatever it is. So you might have someone who has a decision-making authority at the VP level, perhaps, who goes to lunch regularly and is buddies with someone who's an individual contributor in a different department. And so like maybe there's no clear line of authority, but they care about what the thoughts of each other. And so if you're aware of different lines of influence through an organization, you might say, well, we need to get, Vice President so-and-so on board. We think they're currently neutral. Maybe if our ally here who's friends with them can go talk to them, they can flip them to a positive. Or if they're against it, maybe we could at least flip them to being neutral. So it's a lot of like going around having conversations. So you can think of it as sort of a strategy map of who are you going to go and talk to, in what order, and what are you bringing to them, and what are you asking them to do or think differently. Or you might say, hey, now that we've convinced you, I know you're buddies with VP so-and-so, could you go maybe have a conversation with them and see if you can bring them around, So it's sort of like, how might you move opinions in a particular direction? So yeah, it's a pretty powerful tool. It freaks some people out because it seems a little bit sort of conspiracy or nefarious, but I swear these things are going on anyway. You might as well write them down.
Exactly. And that's what I was about to say. All these informal power structures as well that are not visible on the org chart. So I think that was it. Thank you for just elaborating.
Sure.
I'm curious about the games part, because you even mentioned a person who many years ago started thinking about these mind games in the office. Is there like a formal? Are there books in this area? Are there? Where did you get your content? What's out there?
Yeah, a little bit. There's not as much as I'd like there to be, and so when I got into this a few years ago and started digging, I probably found everything there is, and it's not that much. So bear with me. The original concept of games comes out of a branch of psychoanalysis, spearheaded by a person named Eric Berne, who was writing in the 50s and 60s. He's only lived to about, I think, 73. So all of his writings from way back then. But he basically founded a branch of psychotherapy called transactional analysis. And it is a rather large school. There's an international body, there's a US body, there's probably a European body. And so it's a way of approaching psychoanalysis from his work, branching out of his work and adding onto it. And one of the people that I think was a student of his was Steve Karpman, who came up with something called the drama triangle. So if you Google the drama triangle, or sometimes the rescue triangle, that is a really concrete example of a game that people can get stuck in. And so it has to do with how honest we are with the other person about our needs, and can get into situations where, like, for example, rescuing would be doing something for someone that they didn't actually ask for because you think they can't really do it themselves. And then that person becomes resentful because they didn't actually want the help. And you can get in this sort of weird loop with another person when you have those kinds of relationships. So the drama triangle was Karpman's way of exploring how that happens, both in terms of, families and relationships, but also in institutions, and groups, and organizations. And then there's one other person, her name is Dorothy Jongward, who also did some work really early on. It's been a little while, I think, or this stuff was written probably late 70s, early 80s, but still is very useful, where she directly applied the concept of games in a workplace setting. So I was able to dig up a copy of that book, and it was like out of print, yellowed pages from some used bookstore like years ago, but I'm sure there's still some copies out there. But there's
had your own archaeological process.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. Yeah, did a lot of digging. And I think there's a lot, part of, I found it really exciting and interesting to look at this aspect of, kind of organizational psychology and how this stuff happens in organizations. And so, I think I wish there was more on it, but we're actually trying to kind of contribute our own work and research to try to expand and extend that field of thinking ourselves. So yeah, I would encourage people to check it out. There's a lot of really rich material there.
Another aspect I was thinking about, if you were in your current job, in your position, if you were asked to help zebra apps with some of their dysfunction, where would you start?
If I had permission, I would start with the founder and the executive team. In my work, I'm not always in that kind of position, but I think that it is important for the most senior leaders of the organization to take the time required to articulate values and vision and principles. And I would say that it's the most important aspect of their work. So I think that it does happen that in my work, I end up working sometimes with CEOs or senior leaders of organizations who are interested in having their companies be more successful and more healthy. And what is interesting, I mean, for me, it's really important to approach kind of like 4 different thoughts fighting for the front door of my brain right now. So I'm trying to, one is I want to clarify that I really do believe in a lot of, bottom up and middle around kind of work and agitation in organizations as well. So I'm not proposing just a top-down strategy. Just kind of a disclaimer there. I think there's a lot that you can do all throughout the organization. But if you were given your choice, if an organization showed up and said, help us anywhere you want, my first visit would probably be to the boardroom and talk to the executives at the top, because I think that what happens as organizations scale, a lot of times their success initially can be the source of their struggles and I would say failure, but it can create a lot of problems. It sort of backfires, right? Like as you get better at delivering goods and services, and as you add more people and more competence and more procedures, you can lose your way if you don't really invest time on keeping everybody oriented back towards why are we doing this in the first place? What is the vision? Why are we trying to achieve? What are we trying to achieve in the world? And what are our values, and what kinds of things are on the table at this organization, and what kinds of things are not acceptable here, that we've decided that we don't do this sort of thing, or we don't operate in this way. And that's really the real job of leaders. And I think that there's a threshold of leadership development that most leaders of companies go through, particularly if they're founders. I think it's a lot tougher for founders who've been there since the beginning. It was their startup and they were used to being really scrappy and wearing many hats, to grow to the point where they recognize their company kind of has taken on a life of its own, and that their job really is to actually delegate more of the day-to-day operational work and turn their attention towards vision painting and storytelling and objective and goal setting, and then coaching their senior leaders on how to help spread that throughout the company. But that's a hard shift, because you feel a lot of responsibility for the company that you've made. So I have a great deal of empathy for senior leaders who are trying to learn how to let go of the reins a little bit, because there's a lot of fear, like what if I hand responsibility to these people and they do it wrong? What if are they going to destroy my precious thing that I've built. There's a lot of fear and anxiety around letting go of control, but that's not a happy place to be. Like, you can have all that success, but if you're going to be up at night worrying about the company, why did you do it in the first place? Wouldn't it be a lot nicer to say, I've got this great group of leaders that I've hired and I trust them and they're doing a great job and I can sleep at night because I have let go. That, to me, that sounds a lot nicer.
It does, but also probably hard for some people.
Absolutely. Yeah. Most, I would say. It's extraordinarily hard. I make it sound easy. It's not. It's not at all. It's a process.
So I really liked your point on really being articulate on what's the desired behaviors that kind of compose the whole culture, and also what don't we do. I think that's something you sometimes forget to actually talk about. Ivana, did you have any follow-up? Because I have something I really want to ask.
Okay, well then you go ahead. Then
okay. No, it's just with your background, Sam. I was really, really curious to hear. Somewhere in this chapter, there was a talk about how the organization was previously designed, where they had no line managers and they had developers answering phones and so on. And I was just really interested in hearing your take on this kind of shift in the organizational design and like pros and cons of the previous model versus the current, in the light of your work on coaching development teams.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me of that part. I had forgotten. That is a really interesting thing to look at. I have seen a lot of organizations that waited too long to add structure, either management layers, changing the org structure, or policies and procedures. And I'm saying that from a position of being like, I have fairly egalitarian principles, and I do really believe in a lot of autonomy for teams and for individuals in their work. I'm a strong fan and advocate of, people like Dan Pink, author of Drive, and folks like that. So like I am super pro autonomy, and at the same time, I think of management done well as part of the architecture of the organization, right? It's like a communication system or a pipe to have information flow around. Like, I don't think of them so much as, we're so accustomed to thinking of, at least certainly, it's certainly true in the US, and I'm sure it's spread, is that the 20th century industrial command and control style of organization has given people a particular picture of what management means, what a manager is, very sort of top-down, dictatorial, and it doesn't actually have to be that way. And so I think there's a really interesting point. I think organizations should certainly try to allow, startups should try to allow people to remain autonomous in their daily work and working as a team as much as possible. But as you add people to an organization, we've all seen that graphic with the nodes in the graph, and like each time you add a node, it expands the number of communication links in the graph, exponentially or geometrically or whatever it is. I should know that. I'm an engineer, but I've forgotten. In any case, they expand a lot, and it's nonlinear. And so because of that, there's a real sort of physical and cognitive limit to how many people you can really coordinate with on a team. And so then you need teams to split into smaller units, and then someone has to kind of coordinate between those units. And so then management becomes this sort of connective and circulatory tissue around the teams that's really necessary. And so I think that it's a very delicate balancing act, that we want to preserve the creativity and autonomy that we remember from, back when we were a startup and there were only 10 of us and we were in a co-working space and it was so cool. I mean, I love that stuff, that is fun. And then as we grow up, as we have, more business and we're hiring salespeople and we're hiring marketing and we're growing and kind of professionalizing our operation, it's really hard to preserve the good stuff from the early days. No one remembers the crazy bad stuff from the early days that we don't actually want to bring with us, right? Like the late nights, the chaos, what's our policy on ordering a computer and shipping it to our contractor in Nepal? Like nobody knows because we haven't written one yet. Great. So now I'm up for 4 hours trying to write our policy about lending out remote equipment. So the early startup days are often mythologically referred to as, so exciting and fun, but that's the musical montage in the movie. You don't actually get to see all the drudgery behind the scenes. So adding some structure and some organization, and indeed layers of management, I don't think that that's a bad thing, but I think it also has to be done with care and thoughtfulness and compassion. And again, like this is where the senior leaders really have to lean forward and get involved and roll up their sleeves and really be intentional about how they think about the structure of their organization and the mandate to new managers who are being brought in or ICs who are being promoted into more of a hierarchical position. We have to be really careful to set expectations and to be clear about what are our values, what are our leadership values, how do we do leadership here, how do we handle feedback, how do we handle disagreements and conflicts in meetings in front of our colleagues, how do we conduct ourselves? Those are really important questions to be answered.
I think from a timing perspective, we might need to start drawing towards a close.
Sure.
Sam, now having read this part of the book, is there anything that you are hoping that will happen next?
I am really interested to see the way that I want to see how as these values that were unearthed in the archeological dig through someone's laptop, I want to see how that lands with the senior leadership. And it's a little bit like showing someone a picture of themselves in their high school yearbook. Do you remember you used to look like this and dress like this and you believed these things and Bon Jovi was your favorite band, remember? So it's kind of taking them back to the past and how much of that identity of the individual, how much of the purpose still kind of remains in the heart of the leader, and what's their reaction to having that stuff brought back to the surface. I really be curious to see how you play that out in the story.
Amazing.
It could go in a lot of different ways.
Well, no spoilers here.
Right. Yeah.
Well, Sam, it's been amazing to have you on the show and hearing your thoughts. And I'm sure that our listeners will enjoy listening to your reflections too. Where can people find you if they want to ask any follow-up questions or hear more about what you do?
Sure. The two best places to find me are on LinkedIn. I'm very easy to find on LinkedIn, and I spend a lot of time there chatting with people and posting content. So certainly I'm very open to having people reach out there, make a connection, have a conversation. Our work at Startup Patterns is on our website at startuppatterns.com. We've got a great blog there with our articles and thoughts on many of these topics. And there's some tools, some free resources, some videos, lots of stuff you can play with So you can go to startuppatterns.com and talk to me directly on LinkedIn.
Awesome, Sam.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
This was great.
You're listening to Maneuvering Mondays, a podcast about transforming work culture. What are your thoughts on Marie's situation? Have you had a similar experience? And what would you have done? Join the conversation on our LinkedIn page and let's maneuver Mondays together.